Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Litquake, San Francisco's Literary Festival. I'm Jack Bower from Litquake, and our festival is in progress right now. It runs from October 7th through the 23rd. You can find out all of the details at litquake.org. Today, we are honored to be able to present a virtual live event with Carl de Souza. He is author of the new novel, Kaya Days, from Two Lines Press. Carl will be in conversation with Anita Felicelli. Many thanks to Carl and Anita for joining us today. This event is sponsored by Center for the Art of Translation. So Carl's novel is set on the island of Mauritius and tells the story of a young woman searching for her younger brother amidst the chaos of a riot following the unjust death in police custody of the music star known as Kaya, a local seggae musician. So Carl de Souza is a writer born and in Mauritius and lives there. He graduated from the University of London before pursuing a career in education. He has led an intense sports life, mainly in badminton, which is the background of one of his novels. He has published short stories and 6 novels in France. Kaya Days is the first to be translated into English, and he is speaking to us from the island of Mauritius. There's a little bit of rain happening in the region right now, so just bear with us if a connection gets fuzzy. Carl will be in conversation with Anita Felicelli, a great local Bay Area author here. She's author of the novel Chimerica and the short story collection Love Songs for a Lost Continent. Her stories have appeared in many places, including the Massachusetts Review, Alta Journal, and Catapult. She contributes regularly to the San Francisco Chronicle and Los Angeles Review of Books, and she is live with us from the San Francisco Bay Area. A few quick things before we begin. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for the latest updates. You can also support Carl and Anita today by buying their books. You can go to your independent bookstore, or you can also go to Litquake's bookshelf on the bookshop.org platform. We also ask for your support of the Litquake organization to allow us to continue to bring these events for free to book-loving audiences. It's a precarious time in the COVID era, and even just trying to make a living as an artist. So if you believe in keeping literature a key component of San Francisco's cultural landscape, we would appreciate if you could drop us a few dollars, either through Venmo or PayPal, or you can go directly to litquake.org. That's it. We'll have a conversation for about 45 minutes or so, and then we appreciate any audience questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Let's get on with the show. Please welcome Carl and Anita.
Thank you, Jack, and thank you, Litquake, for having us. I'm really excited about this conversation.
Hi, Anita.
Hi. I think it's pretty exciting to have a conversation with an author from Mauritius. I really loved Kaya Days. I think, it really seems to reflect the diversity of Mauritius. It includes, Hindu, Chinese, Muslim, Creole, and Franco-Mauritian characters. And I think, it has an intensity, not only to the language, but also the story. I hoped that perhaps Carl would like to read for 5 to 10 minutes from Kaya Days.
Yes, certainly. But first, a big thank you for having been touched and read my book with a lot of attention. I'd like to thank people like you who are moved by such literature, because my translator, Jeffrey Zuckerman, as well as my publisher, Two Lines Press, it seems a bit for us here in Mauritius, tiny island in the middle of the Indian Ocean, with that sort of population mixed with so many inputs from diverse continents, looks very much like whatever is happening elsewhere in the world. And I think that universality of the theme coming up 20 years after the first publication in France, gives us some meaning about what's happening those days in the COVID, which is a sort of helps us to grasp, to understand what's happening to us. So I'll do some reading. It's about a girl, a Hindu girl from a village near the coast, who's coming to town and see a town that's virtually on fire and doesn't quite understand what's happening to her. Santi knew that she was now in Ram's world. Ram is a little brother she's looking for in this town. And that finding him here would be no easy feat. In the overheated cab, she tried to recall when she had seen her brother last. The young man at the other end of the square was sitting on the sidewalk. He was looking at the cab with all its chrome gleaming in the sun. He had to have seen her moving, sleeping. Maybe he had seen her moving, breathing, because nothing else in the square was moving. She could make out his hunched over, weary profile, as if he were actually scared of being noticed by the car's occupant or by someone else. The rising hum of traffic brought some semblance of normalcy, although it was late in the morning for people to be heading out. So many things seemed to be out of sorts, like sugarcane stunted by a too dry summer, or little brothers gone astray. The sun might have risen, but day hadn't really broken. A metallic scraping echoed amid the empty storefronts. The teenager started. Behind him, a few men were working at the steel grate of a clothing store. He got up, looking torn, scratched his head, took a few steps towards the group, which gave him a hearty hello. Then, changing his mind, he headed for the car with his hands in the pockets of his shorts, moving at an exaggeratedly calm pace. He turned round every so often to see where the others were. They shouted at him. The metal slats had slipped from their tracks. Santi realized she didn't have much time and got out of the car. The guy was now running. His calves bulged. She could see his grimace in the shadow cast by his hat's brim. He didn't stop. When he reached her, he grabbed her by the arm and began dragging her. The group had come back out onto the square and noticed the car. They were all about the same age as the guy in shorts, 19 or 20, and they ambled along unhurriedly. The men pulled Santi across the green along Vandermeer Street and then slipped into the passageway under the old railroad tracks. The others had their sights on the abandoned car. They popped open all the doors and were making it bounce on its suspension. Once they lost interest, they flipped it over, opened the gas tank and set it on fire. Santi could hear them shouting, laughing, and chanting long before the flames rose above the sheet metal roofs. The two made their way down to the road leading past the monastery. He let go of her arm. His fingers had left red marks. Gasping for breath, he asked her where she had been heading before realizing how ridiculous the question was. Where can anyone go in a cab without a driver? Where can anyone go when it's been set on fire? Where can anyone go when they've been kidnapped? Do you know Ram? Was the only response he got. He shrugged. There's dozens of Rams. Let me think. There's Ramon, the sheet metal guy on Ignace Road. There's Rambo, but nobody's seen him since all the fighting last night. And there's Ramses. She wasn't listening. She'd stopped to pull off the shoes, which were starting to hurt. She sat on a milestone and examined the purplish blister she developed from running. I was saying the third one is Ramses. Some people call him Ram, but some others call him Ses. I only met him twice at a party where we were all drunk. He DJs at the Sphinx. He stopped talking to take a look at the girl. As he stood over, what he saw was the too short garnet dress torn on the sides and the thick dark hair spinning over her face as she focused on the blister. Her shoe had fallen into the gutter. He saw girls this every often. They'd come from the villages to find work, but at night, pimps were always busy driving Creole girls back to the countryside in the wee hours. But this girl was Indian. She had been left behind in the night. He'd never been with an Indian girl. He didn't go looking for them, like some of the guys from Trev who fantasized about unwrapping their saris. He thought of Indian girls as timid, awkward, unsophisticated. He wouldn't want his friends to see him with this girl who had purple blisters, limping in what was left of a dress. The women in his part of town hadn't gone outside in 2 days. Their mothers had kept them at home. They were listening to CDs of Kaya, the singer who'd been found dead in his jail cell. They kept repeating his lines that called for more justice, for Simer la lumière, while the guys went out and protested his death by throwing rocks at the police stations and setting grocery stores on fire. It was a blister on the side of a little toe that she was trying to rub away. So I'll stop here maybe, and we can go on with your questions. Maybe take a little bit afterwards, if you wish.
Okay, that sounds good. There's a little bit of an echo, so I apologize. I have a lot of questions, as you already know. I'm very moved by the powerful language and by Santi, and not only as a character, but also, just as a member of this larger island community. She's part of a smaller community, Hindu community, but actually all the communities seem to be in conversation with one another in the novella. I was curious why you chose to focus on Santi, a Hindu girl, rather than a character who was directly involved in the riots that occurred after the musician Kaya was arrested and died in police custody. I was curious if you had ever thought of writing about him directly, or from the perspective of somebody who was rioting.
Yep. The answer didn't come from me, but from a writer friend who, when I was criticized for the novel for not talking about Kaya himself directly, he said Santi represents the island with a majority of Indians, and Santi represents that part of the island that's astonished by whatever is happening, everything being upturned and everything being on fire. And she looks at seemingly innocent eyes, with those eyes, at what's happening all around her. She discovers at the same time the town she comes from is the countryside, and she discovers the busy life in town, and still rendered more infernal because of the riots. And this is for her really a change in her life. She's been up to this moment a protected Indian girl, normally doing housework with a mom, and she goes and looks for this little guy who is, as a little male, allowed to go in town. She's not, and she goes after him, and she doesn't find him at all. And the answer comes from this friend who tells me, okay, but this is spontaneous, and you have been speaking about that, and I had to agree afterwards. Yes.
It was a spontaneous decision that where you just found yourself in her point of view.
Say again, please. From her point of view, yes, the whole novel. That's what you mean. Yes, I see the riots and I see the town from her point of view. That's going to change somewhere in the novel. But to start with, she's as astonished as us all in Mauritius. Not only the Hindu community, but all of us who are non Afro-Creole, who see that things, even for myself, I heard about Kaya. I knew, of course, of his existence, but my son and my daughter knew about him, knew his songs, and I really knew about his existence and his art after his death. So Kaya came as a Mauritian cyclone. The Kaya days came as a cyclone, unexpected, and washing everything around and making us suddenly aware of certain things that were hidden by our history and by the social peace. I put many inverted brackets, inverted commas behind this statement. Yeah.
Yeah, and even though it's in a third person close perspective throughout, it does shift perspectives into other characters, consciousnesses as the novella goes on. What were you thinking as you did that? Were you looking for where the energy of the story was, or did you mean something different by that?
Right, midway, that was quite voluntary, by the way. Now, the first part was just spontaneous. Santi comes from a village, gets into the town. People take care of her, take control of her. She goes into a brothel, meets people who sort of use her. She's driven around the town by taxi driver, an unusual taxi driver. And then she meets Ronaldo Milanak, that Creole guy. And therefore she experiences as a woman, as a girl, becoming a woman, takes place very quickly. Maybe too quickly because the things were rushed during these days. There's a shift in the sense that after, let's say, midway in the novel, she takes over. She decides that she is going to go down into the gorges, into the ravine, and follow the river and look for follow the brother and so on. There's a definite shift, but probably in my mind before it is in the mind of my character.
Yeah. I do think it's interesting that the characters are quite different in their positionality and their level of power within the society and the extent to which she's acted upon. And yet there's a propulsiveness as we stay in her point of view, which I think is fairly unusual. I also thought that the diversity, as I mentioned when we first started talking, was interesting. It interested me because America is similarly rich and diverse in cultural traditions, but a lot of literary novels here, novels that would be, compared to yours, would feature characters that are from communities that are limited, maybe in their interactions with other communities. And yours, there's a really strong sense of clashing and many communities, and you have a strong sense of like the liveliness of that within the novella. And yet there's a really strong sense of tension, and and obviously with the riots, that reflects a reality. I wondered to what extent it's reflective of the reality now, because it's talking about a period in 1999, right? And I read an interview with you and Jeffrey Zuckerman, who's your translator. that indicates that it became peaceful, that, you know, that there was kind of a hypocritical peace that arose after all these riots. So I was curious to what extent the novella reflects the current day Mauritius.
Mm. Yes, it's a bit paradoxical in the sense that we have been a very peaceful country. We are people. The way people look at us from a distance, we look like you know, heaven in the middle of the Indian Ocean, with so many communities living peacefully, and it's very much the same thing in other places, towns, cities like Paris, for example, which is quite in the turmoil those days, as revealed particularly by the COVID pandemic, and others in the United States. So in our own case, let's say that the communities have had to tolerate each other because we're an island. You can't run away from an island. You've got to live with other people. You've got to tolerate them, and we are a very hypocritical community population, in the sense that we don't say openly what we think of others, and it's not well considered to be criticizing openly what's happening elsewhere. So everybody looks. Cares for his own private garden, and so things go along rather peacefully, except when a known singer starts smoking pot at a meeting, or and everybody goes into the streets because for once they understand that they are not being cared for. And this is a thing that has been building on since the times of slavery. You know, freeing people after the abolition of slavery in the middle of the 19th century is one thing, but re-establishing them in their rights in the society, giving them proper education, giving them proper housing, basic needs, is something else. I say basic need, but there's something more. It's being represented in the government, for example. They are not really present there in the assembly, National Assembly. And these people have got nothing to lose. These are our compatriots, and we can't live with 30%, 35% of the population being nowhere in the population setup. So when things come, let's hope the pandemic doesn't trigger something. It could, with people without jobs, without means to get the basic things, the everyday life needs, whatever they need in everyday life. So we are a set of communities of tectonic plates that sort of move around, and from time to time there's something that rubs in the wrong way, and it shoots out. It fortunately hasn't happened in the past very often. Once very violently during the Second World War, and then the Kaya days, and at some time just before independence. But let's say these occasions occur very seldom, and we have now, while it is still time, to re-establish these people. Things are being done in education, but things in education are being done for these people who are not, who don't find their place in this society. When they fail, there are lots of remedial measures, but nothing really as from the moment a child is born and gets into society.
Yeah, and it seems like in a lot of different countries, the structures persist even after conditions are supposed to have changed. I was curious, I believe you're the son of a police officer, and I was curious as to whether that influenced or did not influence your political and literary perspectives as they occur in this novella?
I missed the last sentence because it was the contact was fluctuating. Please say again. Last sentence, please.
Yes, I was curious as to how being the son of a police officer, which I believe you are, influenced or didn't influence your political and literary perspectives.
Definitely influenced. It was definitely influenced from many points of view. The first one was my father was transferred 14 times during his career. That is, we were moved from one place to another, from the towns to the countryside, and even to Rodrigues Island, which is about 350 miles away from Mauritius. And so I lived in very different setups and had an experience which was at the same time very rich because I met lots of people, but very disturbing because you couldn't make friends for more than 2 years, 2.5 years. Everything you have to leave your school, leave your friends, leave your house and your garden, and move to something else. So it made us capable of a lot of adaptation. Fortunately, there was my mother was a teacher, and she sort of helped us to catch up. Both were very keen readers, and so we had always a lot of books around the place. So it's not a real policeman as such. And I remember that he cleared a wasteland just near our house to make it a parade ground, and even stage a riot there to have people practicing, to have his police officers practicing how to contain things like that. And he set himself in the rioters and got caught, and that was it was very theatrical, and no, it was a character, and that was the way I look at him, and I'm thankful for the way. And when he was retired afterwards, I got some very astonishing comments from him on the 1968 riots in France, for example, the Paris students' riot. He said they deserve it because there's been so much injustice going around. And from his point of view, I was much younger than him because he married very late. I was quite astonished, and he was not an easy character, by the way. He was a creative sort of fellow. He was perhaps more artist in the family than myself. Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. Was he a good storyteller? Did you hear about his work, or?
Who?
Your father?
Yeah.
I was just curious
whether
he was also a storyteller and whether he told stories.
Yeah. No, I was quite, he was very, very spontaneous and very unorthodox in the way things. I always had my slept on his shoulder. I remember when I was 3, 4, 5, I always fell asleep with my daily story. He could make a story of everything. And so that was very much, we didn't know anything of what was happening in his job as such. I know that when he retired, it was because he was absolutely fed up with everything that concerned the police force in general. He had been the number 3 or number 2 or number 3 in the ranking, and he just walked away. And no, it was 20 years after, or more than that, 30 years after, that his orderly came and told me a few things that I heard about how he was disgusted by many things that were taking place in his days. But not everybody was rotten, mind you. There were many of his fellow officers who were quite okay. But as everywhere else, there are things in the police force that one likes or one doesn't like.
Yeah, and so there's a ranking system. I'm sorry, I just wanted to know what the ranking system is.
Yeah, like everywhere else, you've got commissioners, assistant commissioners, and things like that. It was pretty well ranked. Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's interesting. We have so much going on in terms of discussions about policing in the United States. So I thought that would be interesting to
But
hear
our
about.
system was very simple. Yeah, our system was very simple. There was a single police force, and there were those who were in charge of the traffic, which was one main branch, another one for everything concerning crimes and so on. The CID, Crime Investigation Department, or Criminal Investigation Department, or something like that. He was in charge of that at some time, and then there was a third one about administration. So on. So this was a pretty simple English British system, you know, that was it. Yeah. It's more complicated in France, for example. I don't know about the position in the States. Yeah.
Yeah, and is it common? Was your father Hindu, or was he of a different background? And was he part of whatever the majority within the police force there is?
Majority of what? Sorry, Anita?
The majority, what was his ethnic background?
Right. Okay. So that's a big definition of what our population is, particularly what is termed general population, which means nothing, in fact. Now, you've got the Hindu population, which is about 45%. And you've got about around 25 of Muslims. And then the rest are called general population. Now, general population goes from the African people of African descent to the Franco-Mauritian who are white. And so there's a whole mix of people around, like myself, where I've got French ancestors, but as well Indian, but as well African people who were my forefathers. But mind you, in Mauritius, people are very subtle to find out exactly in which position you are. So you're somewhere midway or three-quarter way or something like that, which gives you a sort of status. Much less now. But in these days, people knew where to stand, and without going too far up for what is considered up or down. And that was something which was quite, I don't know in other sugar islands, probably it's the same thing, right?
Yeah, I think that's true in India and America as well, where there's positionalities and people trying to figure out where you fit. The book is dedicated to someone named Pramesh, who had died. I wondered if you might tell us a little bit about, you know, his death and why you dedicated the book to him.
Yeah. So as I told you before, this was a very personal book. It was written for me not to go crazy after the events, because I was so disturbed by having to evacuate the whole school, having to see people running around about the streets and so on, that I decided that one solution that I had as a writer was to, and you know that very well, as I suppose, is to jot down a few things, let things steam out of your head. And I had done this for about 30 or 35 pages. And Pramesh was one of our caretakers, a handyman. And he was running about the street all the time. He was a Hindu. He had married a Creole girl. He was going in the streets and coming to give me a sort of report of what was happening outside. I was stuck in the school, and so he told me they've set KFC on fire. or they are burning such and such store, or they have upturned 3 buses and something like that. He went on his motorbike and came back. And in the evening, on one of those particularly heated days, we got a phone call that Pramesh had disappeared. And it couldn't be explained by the fact that his father was somebody who was quite well known and so on. And afterwards, his body was found in a store he had probably been looting. And so that was, and he had done that for his daughter. So that was a sort of moral problem where people were asking themselves, in those days, was looting such a big fault, and was going about and taking things that you need for your family? Now, so there are some quite well-known people in Mauritius who were found driving their cars with lots of provisions come from the stores and so on. So I was quite moved by, Pramesh was quite close to me. So there was many people around said, okay, it's disappeared because he's been stealing and things like that. But it wasn't as simple as that for me. So I started writing about this. And as I told you, being on a personal relation with the Evans through Pramesh was something that drove this whole story, which was not a report finally, which was something that was a novel, personal, subjective forward.
Yeah, and I think that segues nicely. I was very curious about your process, but it sounds like, at least what I've pieced together, is that it came kind of in a rush, and then you submitted a different book to a publisher in France, and they were interested in this book. Can you talk a little bit about your process for this book beyond that, whether you came back and completely re-envisioned the entire book after the publisher was interested, or whether you had already really kind of envisioned the whole book?
You're not far from what happened, but not. When there was one book that was being published by this Paris editor, and it was jettisoned, which is a much thicker book about boat people. And they said, okay, we're interested by this book, but please send us a sample of what is there, for what you got at hand for a workshop. And she came to Mauritius and at some time told me, okay, we are going to publish your other book, but I'm fascinated by this one because there's something in that book that sort of drives me around. There's a lot of energy. There's something that's personal. This is what we want to publish first. We were quite astonished at home. We said, no way, 35 pages of something that's personal. And then I completed the book. It was about 90 or 100 pages. But it had an influence on the other book, which I rewrote, and on my other books afterwards, because I found out that to go into a dream world where the reality and what is in your mind as a writer, as somebody who wants to create something, two different things. With my scientific background, I was very rationalist, sort of being very, very careful about details, and very careful about the style, and very, and so it changed a bit the way the way I was writing, in the sense that it sort of oozed out of me and flowed out of me, so that this is exactly what this book has been doing. I didn't touch much of it afterwards. I let it as such, and it was published with very little modifications. afterwards, my other books had this sort of oniric, dreamlike aspect, which sort of characterized my way of looking at things and of not separating what is the way you perceive things as a rational person, which we are all, and the way we imagine things, which all is another part of our global personality, humanity.
Yeah, and I think that's a really nice way of putting it. So if this is your larger vision in terms of language, how does it fit in terms of the subject matter of your other novels? I see you have a fairly large body of work, which I haven't read and which isn't translated into English. So just to situate us, you know, how did this fit in terms of content?
Yeah, I must tell you about my first two novels before Kaya Days. One is about, it could be translated in English by the blood of the Englishman, which is Le sang de l'Anglais in French, and which is about blood in the sense of his belonging to this community, this mixed up community I was telling you before. Is not quite white, is white, but not that of a wealthy family, and so he's not well considered. That's the story, one of my first story. The second is probably the most successful, which is The House That Would Walk to the Sea, La Maison qui marchait vers le large. And this one was pretty well accepted in general, because it was staged in Paris, in Mauritius, in Réunion Island nearby, and that worked very well. And up to that point, people followed me without any problem. When I started writing the Kaya Days, I found out that many of those people who expected a biography of Kaya, which Kaya certainly deserves, were a bit disappointed. At the same time, better known writers like Anand Devi or a few others who were around understood that I had taken a step and that there would not be any backpedaling, and that I would go with that sort of style with the boat people, afterwards even with the badminton novel, which is quite a metaphorical one, where the shuttle is something that's very interesting. It's at the same time feathery, it's feminine, and at the same time it's very violent. And it's extremely interesting that I could shuttle with you, Anita, that is getting the shuttle to you in the US, getting it back somewhere, because a shuttle is something else as well. And when it's set as a formal game, the net makes it impossible for me to give you the shuttle. I sort of subtract the shuttle from you. I don't want you to touch the shuttle. And then we start counting points, which is a completely different philosophy. So I went along that thing, and I found out that that could take me quite far in the colonization of my country, and so on and so forth, traditions and so on. And those are the things. And then the last novel is interesting because it's set up in the place where I live now, where my father lived, which is in the middle of the sugarcane fields. And that's the last one, yeah.
Yeah, I'm really fascinated by this, by the comparison to badminton. I had friends who used to play badminton, and it is interesting how it has this certain kind of grace, but then there are these violent moments. And actually that does remind me of the rhythm of this book. So that makes a lot of sense, because there are, you know, various points of sort of violence or getting kind of slammed with the emotional impact of something. But then you kind of continue on in this very hypnotic way the rest of the time. So I was curious.
It's interesting how this game is getting. he's catching up. He's getting it comes from Asia in general. No, it's British, of course, and the Asians, the Indonesians, and so on took it over, and then took it to China, which is now top of the world, and so on. So historically, it's very interesting, and also I'm also extremely interesting by the way men and women play it differently and quite interestingly, and you can play it just as a beginning. And no, that's one of my fascinations.
Yeah, and you know, I think you have kind of an interest in gender. I've been reading a little bit about Mauritius and gender. We didn't actually talk about that, but I was curious if you could sort of shed some light on gender relations. And now I was reading an interesting essay by Ariel Saramondi. I don't know if I'm pronouncing her name correctly, but she's half, I think she's and partially.
It's a pen name. It's a pen name.
Oh, okay. Well,
yeah, Ariel is one of my friends, and it's a pen name, and she's writing quite interesting things. Yes, about the gender interactions. And yeah, she's a very keen observer, and she's becoming quite young, and she's becoming a very good observer of the Mauritian society. Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
And by the way, the gender relationships, as everywhere else, it's something that worries all people. By the way, how difficult it is to find one's way in society, to be able to be listened to as a person, not only as a mother or as a wife or things like that. Well, the usual themes. But in Mauritius as well, you've got the weight of traditions, because we've got a heavy Oriental tradition, a heavy Catholic tradition, and so on, which sorts of has got to be redefined to allow everybody to be able to speak out. I'm more on the question of on a dialogue or an exchange between the different genders than anything else. I don't think that that would lead us. I think as much has got to be learned from each other, as much as got to be learned for couples to be able to function correctly. And we have got a long way to do to be able, as well as parents, single or married, to be able to raise children. I think that's the same sort of problem as everywhere else.
Yeah, and it's definitely a global-wide potential tension. I wondered if everybody would like to think about a question. Feel free to submit them in the chat. Otherwise, we can keep talking, and I'll just try and notice if there are any questions coming in. I had other questions, so we can keep going and see.
You can ask them. You can ask them. I can just. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm really enjoying talking to you. I wish this was going to go on a little bit longer. I was curious, besides Ariel, who I guess is a nom de plume for a different writer, or a writer with a different name, and Ananda Devi, what other authors have potentially influenced you or that you recommend? With this book, I thought of Ulysses, though this is really much tinier in terms of scope. You know, than Ulysses, or rather size. The scope is still very huge. Or To the Lighthouse, along with you know, an Irish author, Mike McCormick's Solar Bones, and Han Orstevik's Love. There's you know, a number of contemporary novels that were called to mind from other countries. I hoped you might talk about that.
Yeah. Let's say that very early in our school days, we were separated between, let's say, literary side and scientific side. So I came back to literature through a mathematics teacher who sort of lent me lots of English novels. And much before reading French authors or being interested in French poetry, for example, I was captivated by people like Graham Greene or Thomas More or the traditional novels of these days. And then later on, I finally, during the past years, people like Nabokov or Romain Gary influenced me a lot, and I understood why. It is because they are sort of seated between two chairs. They're always in between two cultures and two languages. Both of them have been starting to write in other languages and afterwards writing in English, like I'm doing at the moment, writing directly in English in spite of having formidable Jeffrey on my side to translate my novels. But I'm also writing directly in French and in English and finding a lot of fun in that, even though our English is a bit formal and schoolish from time to time. So these are the people I've been reading. And let's say on your side, Cormac McCarthy, certainly. The Road, and certainly No Country for Old Men, which was, by the way, published by our own publisher and my own publisher in Paris. Yeah. So
yeah, that's
influenced certainly by these people. Yeah,
I can definitely see the Cormac McCarthy in your work. Are you? We have a question from Nancy Liu. Are you able to speak to how much Mauritian literature in any language is taught in school in Mauritius?
Am I able to speak in?
Can you? She's asking how much Mauritian literature in any language, French or another language, English, is taught in school in Mauritius, or is it? I think the contrast is.
It has improved. It has improved a lot. It has improved a lot during the past years because. Firstly, because there are many Mauritian writers per square mile or per square kilometer compared to other places in the world. There are lots of us writing at the moment on various subjects. One person like Marie-Thérèse Imbert in France is quite well known, and Jean-Marie Le Clésio, of course, the Nobel Prize, who's of French and Mauritian descent. And as well, lots of Mauritian authors who are in English and in French. There are certainly more authors in French than in English, but there are some in Hindi, for example, and have been translated, and they are starting to be present, but probably that can still be improved. We are still under the influence of, I would say, the necessary influence, thankfully enough, from authors from outside, because keeping to ourselves only wouldn't be a good thing. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. We have another question from Kathleen McCrea or McCrae. Mr. de Souza, were you interested in Kaya or his work before the news of his mysterious death came to light? And she also says, thank you for joining us, which I also echo,
I was not at all. I was not at all. Still more so that we had a very good musician in the school I was heading at that time. And he said seggae, which is the local version, the seggae version of reggae, according to him, was a dead end. He said, there's no way. Why go along this way? There's nothing in that. Keep to the traditional seggaes. And how wrong he was. I don't know if Kaya's death sort of boosted his popularity. Could be. It could be. But the thing is that I discovered Kaya, and I discovered the poetry of his work much after his death. I'm very sorry I had to catch up. Huh? My kids were ahead of me on that subject. Yep.
Yeah, So you talked to your kids about them. So was there potentially a generational difference in who knew of Kaya?
Oh yeah, there's a lot. In fact, there's a lot of generational difference because we have lived things. We have lived the British colonization. We've lived the fact of independence that it sort of tore us apart, about 55% for, 45% against. And we've lived very difficult years when people didn't have jobs and had to emigrate to Australia and to South Africa and elsewhere, Britain and so on. And then many of those kids were very young when Kaya died. My kids were 20-ish. So they could understand up to a certain point. But when I speak to my grandson, who's quite interested to know now what has happened, he has got to be informed, and he's got to be guided to go and find, because you get lots of things about heroism. You know, characters who've been brilliant are very often sanctified. I would like people to say that I look down on Kaya, not at all. He's a brilliant artist. But the fact is, after the death of people, after the death of artists, the image that persists of them is not necessarily historically exact.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think we're actually about to run out of time. I was hoping to maybe end on one last note, because you had mentioned, sort of the criticism from fellow Mauritians, because you didn't try to find a rational explanation for the riots after Kaya died. Can you tell us a little about that criticism briefly, and how you feel about it, and to what extent it misses what you might be trying to do artistically?
Now, the criticisms I faced was because my writing was not recognized as compared to what it was before. That was the first criticism. Okay. The second was that I hadn't written directly on Kaya. As you said before, I had used a character who seemed out of place, and she was out of place. We were out of place in those Kaya days. And so that was not understood except by people who are very keen on literature. And when I look at the way novels or short stories or even poetry is written those days, it seems that the problem is very much the same. Let's say that my other novels were more accessible in general, and things have smoothed up, and we can talk, and those persons, those journalists maybe, who didn't quite agree with my point of view, have had a long 20 years is a lot, and we are certainly on speaking terms, and we discuss, and I think there's a lot to be said on our own society here as we live. And this brings me to a book on which I'm working a lot those days. That is a collection of short stories from all those authors, even those who were against me at the time, and many others like Litquake, Ananda Devi, and so on, Ariel Sabramandi, as you just mentioned. And we are all trying to put together texts and even paintings from our artists to bring a sort of a book in this tempest that surrounds us of the pandemic, of the political turmoil, of everything that's rushing around us, and saying that we have got a sort of oceanic culture if not civilization, without being pretentious, which is interesting for us to realize, to start with, and then to share with other people and welcome any interaction with them. So I'm on that book at the moment, and this would be quite interesting to see how those neighboring texts function with our readers and others, of course.
Yeah, I'm very excited to read this book. So I hope to keep looking out for it. That sounds exciting. And, you know, Jack mentions, and I agree, buy Carl's book and support your local independent bookstore. I think we have run out of time, but thank you everyone who came to this Litquake panel. It was very exciting for me, and I really enjoyed speaking to you, Carl.
Thank you, Anita. Thanks for all. Thanks, Jack.
All right, Jack, if you wanted to close out any further, if there were any other things, otherwise, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. And thank you also to the Center for the Art of Translation for sponsoring this event. Litquake continues through October 23rd. The details are at litquake.org. Thank you, Carl. Thank you, Anita. It was beautiful. And fortunately, we have it recorded so we can watch it again if we wish. Thanks again.